The room was quiet, save for the soft ticking of the antique clock on the wall. James Weston stood by the floor-to-ceiling windows of his penthouse, staring out at the sprawling skyline beneath him. The city that never slept, the city that he had built his empire in, was now just a blur of lights and noise. But all he felt was a deep, suffocating silence. His hands gripped the edge of the window frame as he gazed at the horizon, feeling the weight of the loneliness that had been creeping in over the years. The view was magnificent, as it always had been. Below him, the streets were filled with people rushing to and fro. But up here, in his world of marble floors and golden accents, he was utterly alone. It wasn't just the physical isolation of the room that bothered him. It was the emotional distance that had grown between him and the people who were supposed to matter most. He had everything that money could buy: cars, mansions, vacations to places most could only dream of. But somewhere along the way he had lost the very thing that made those possessions worth having: the people who mattered. "What's the point of all this?" he whispered to himself. The question lingered in the air, unanswered. He had worked tirelessly, sacrificed countless hours to build a legacy. But at what cost? His wife Laura, once his confidant and partner in everything, had become a distant figure. They no longer shared late-night talks or whispered promises of forever. Now their conversations were reduced to polite exchanges, mostly about the children or household matters. The spark they had once shared had long since faded into routine, and his children, his beloved children, had grown up in the shadow of his success. They had everything they could ever want, yet somehow they didn't seem to need him. They were too busy with their own lives, their own ambitions. The laughter that once filled the halls of their home was now a distant memory. James felt the ache of it all, the absence of connection, the lack of warmth. He had been surrounded by people his entire life, yet somehow he felt more alone than ever. What was he really living for? He took a deep breath, letting the cool night air fill his lungs. As he did, an idea began to form in his mind, an idea so radical, so risky that even he hesitated to consider it fully. What if he removed the one thing that had always been there for him, his wealth, and tested the bonds of his family? What if he took away everything they relied on and saw how they would react? Would they still care for him, or had they only been interested in the life he could provide? He closed his eyes, imagining the fallout. His heart raced, but there was a strange sense of clarity in the chaos of his thoughts. For the first time in years he felt a flicker of hope, like the beginning of something new, something that could change everything. Without another word, he turned away from the window and picked up the phone. "Get me Michael," he said, his voice cold but determined. Michael was his personal assistant, efficient, loyal, and quick to act. If anyone could help him execute this plan, it was Michael. "Yes, Mr. Weston?" came the voice on the other end of the line. "I need you to make some arrangements," James began, his tone unwavering. "I want you to begin shutting down all operations, liquidate the assets, transfer the funds into my personal account, and tell the board that the company is bankrupt. I'm done with this life." There was a pause on the other end of the line. James could almost hear Michael's confusion through the silence. "Sir, are you sure about this? The impact will be enormous." "I'm sure," James replied, his voice cold and final. "This is the only way to know if they care about me for who I am, not what I have. Hit subscribe and leave a comment with where you're watching from. This story might just spark a new beginning. What's one thing that always pushes you forward even when things get tough?" James Weston sat alone in his small cabin, nestled on the outskirts of a remote village, far from the bustling city he once ruled. The silence here was different, more profound, more reflective. It wasn't the deafening silence of loneliness, but one that forced him to confront the choices he had made and the life he had lived. As he sat by the crackling fire, his thoughts drifted back to the past, back to the beginning, back to when life was simpler. He had come from nothing, born into a small, modest family in a run-down neighborhood on the outskirts of town. His father had worked long hours as a mechanic, fixing cars and barely scraping by. His mother worked as a nurse, often coming home late, exhausted, but still managing to care for James and his younger sister, Emma. Money had always been tight, but they had each other, and that was enough. James's first memories were of playing outside with his sister, running through the muddy streets, dreaming of something better. His parents would remind him that education was the key to breaking the cycle of poverty, and so he worked hard. He was determined to change his fate. Through sheer will and determination, he graduated college with honors and landed a job at a small startup. It wasn't much, but it was a start. He didn't mind the late nights and long hours. He had a goal, and nothing would stop him from reaching it. But somewhere along the way, the drive for success began to consume him. The small startup grew into a massive corporation, and with it, James's influence and wealth expanded. He moved up the ranks quickly, all the while building his empire. And with that came the sacrifices. The woman he met during his college years, Laura, had been the love of his life. They met in a crowded cafe, sharing a love for literature and deep conversations about their dreams for the future. She had a fire in her that matched his ambition, and they were inseparable. It wasn't long before they married, and soon after, their first child, Emma, was born, followed by their son, Jake. At first, everything seemed perfect. Laura was supportive of his goals, and they built their lives together. But as his wealth and power grew, so did the distance between them. Laura became more concerned with their children's schedules and their home, while James was consumed with meetings, investments, and business deals. The spark that once lit their relationship began to flicker out. He tried to fix it, he really did, but it was too late. As he climbed the corporate ladder, his personal life began to unravel. Nights spent in boardrooms replaced family dinners. Weekends spent traveling for business overshadowed their time at the beach. Slowly but surely, Laura grew more distant. The affection she once gave him became a formality. She no longer saw him as the man who had shared her dreams, but as the man who had become a stranger, swallowed by his empire. And the children, Jake and Emma, had their own lives. Their need for him, if it ever existed, was gone. They were teenagers now, consumed with their own worlds of school, friends, and social media. He was no longer a part of their lives in any meaningful way. The realization hit him hard. But it wasn't until that fateful night, standing in front of the mirror, staring at a man he hardly recognized, that he knew something had to change. He had built everything except what mattered most: his wealth, his success, his empire. All of it seemed so insignificant now. The mansion he lived in, the private jets, the endless supply of luxury, none of it could fill the emptiness he felt inside. The love of his family was what he craved, but it had slipped through his fingers, slowly eroding as he focused on everything but them. It was then that the idea struck him. What if he could strip away everything? What if he could take the wealth, the success, and the status and test if his family would still love him? He wasn't sure of the answer, but he needed to find out. As the night deepened, James lay back on his bed, staring at the rough wooden ceiling. He missed the soft sound of Laura's breathing beside him. He missed the way their children used to run into his arms, eager to tell him about their day. But those days were gone. He had a choice now, a choice that could either bring his family back together or tear them further apart. Tomorrow, he would make the call. He would start the process of closing down his empire, moving the money into his personal account, and leaving it all behind. It was a gamble, but it was the only way to know if love, not money, would be the foundation of his family's bond. Hit subscribe and leave a comment with where you're watching from. This story might just spark a new beginning. What's one thing that always pushes you forward, even when things get tough? The next morning, James woke with a strange sense of determination. The sun was barely peeking over the horizon, casting a soft orange glow across the small cabin where he had chosen to retreat. The world outside was quiet, a stark contrast to the chaos that was about to unfold in his life. He had made his decision, and there was no turning back now. He sat at the small wooden table in the corner of the room, his fingers idly tapping against the surface. His mind raced with thoughts of what would happen once his family found out. Would they be angry, shocked, or would they, as he feared, be indifferent? James had always prided himself on his ability to control every situation, every aspect of his life. But in this moment, as he prepared to tear down the empire he had spent decades building, He felt a sense of vulnerability he hadn't experienced in years. His fingers hovered over the phone, the number to his assistant Michael already programmed into the device. With a deep breath, he dialed. "Michael, it's time," James said, his voice steady, though a tinge of anxiety lingered beneath the surface. "I want you to proceed with the plan. Start by liquidating all the assets. Transfer everything into my personal account. I need the company to appear bankrupt. No exceptions." There was a brief pause on the other end. "Are you sure about this, Mr. Weston? This will have a significant impact, not just on the company, but on your family, too." "I know," James replied, his voice unwavering. "It's the only way. Let's move forward." He ended the call feeling an odd sense of finality. There was no going back now. The foundation of his wealth, the very thing that had defined him, was about to crumble. And with it, the life he had built for his family. He could only wait now to see how they would react. Back in the city, life continued as normal at the Weston family mansion. Laura was busy in the kitchen, preparing breakfast for their 2 children, Emma and Jake. The house was large, but it felt strangely empty lately. The laughter of their children had grown quieter over the years, and the sound of footsteps on the marble floors felt hollow. Laura glanced up at the clock on the wall, noting the time. James was usually already home by now. He had a morning routine of checking his emails and reviewing company reports. But this morning was different. There was no sign of him. She felt a small twinge of concern. Lately, James had been distant, his presence more of a formality than something that filled the space with warmth. She couldn't remember the last time they had shared a real conversation, just the two of them. Sure, they had talked about the kids, about finances, about trivial things, but the spark, the connection they had once shared seemed to have vanished. "Mum, where's Dad?" Emma asked, her voice breaking through Laura's thoughts. She was standing in the doorway, dressed in her school uniform, a look of mild concern on her face. Laura hesitated. "He's probably busy, sweetie. You know how he gets. Don't worry about him." Emma nodded absently and went to grab her backpack. Laura's gaze lingered on her daughter's retreating figure. Emma was growing up so fast, and it felt like she was slipping away, just like James had. She didn't know how to reach her anymore. The bond they once had was fraying, and the more she tried to repair it, the more it seemed to unravel. Her thoughts were interrupted when the phone rang. It was Michael, James's assistant. "Hello?" Laura answered, her voice sounding slightly tense. "Mrs. Weston, I regret to inform you that the company has encountered some serious financial issues. Mr. Weston has made the decision to declare bankruptcy, and as of today, all operations have been suspended." Michael's voice was calm. Almost too calm, Laura's heart skipped a beat. "What do you mean, bankruptcy? This can't be real. James must be mistaken." "I'm afraid it's true, Mrs. Weston," Michael replied. "The company is shutting down. All the assets are being liquidated, and the funds have been transferred to Mr. Weston's personal account." Laura's mind raced. This wasn't like James. He had always been the steady one, the one who could weather any storm. What was happening? Why was he doing this? The thought of losing everything, not just financially but emotionally, sent a wave of panic through her chest. How would the children react? How would they survive without the luxury and comfort they had grown accustomed to? Before she could ask any more questions, Michael continued, "I'll keep you updated as more information comes through, but for now, I think it's important to speak with Mr. Weston as soon as possible." The line went dead. Laura stood there, holding the phone in her hand, the weight of the news sinking in. She didn't know what to feel. Anger, betrayal, confusion? Or was it all just resignation to the fact that the life they had built together was slipping through their fingers? She glanced at the children, both of whom had come back into the room by now, their eyes wide with confusion. "Mum, what's going on?" Jake asked, his voice tinged with concern. I don't know yet, sweetheart," she said, her voice wavering. "But we need to find your father and get to the bottom of this." As the hours passed, James's decision was beginning to take shape. He had started something irreversible. Soon Laura would know that the man she had spent years with, the man she thought she knew, had become a stranger to her. The power he had once wielded would now be taken from him, and with it, everything he thought was secure in his life. Would this move bring his family closer? Or would it push them further away, leaving him with nothing but the realization that the love he had hoped to test was already gone? Only time would tell. It was late afternoon when Laura finally got through to James. After hours of unanswered calls and messages, the weight of uncertainty hung heavily in the air. She had spent the day pacing the house, trying to make sense of everything. The children were starting to ask more questions, their confusion turning into concern. Emma had already left for a friend's house, but Jake, ever the quieter one, lingered near her, sensing the tension in the house. Laura couldn't stand seeing his innocent face clouded by fear. She needed answers, and the only person who could provide them was James. When the phone rang again, her heart skipped. She glanced at the caller ID, and for the first time in hours, a wave of relief washed over her. It was him. She answered quickly. "James, where are you? What is going on?" Her voice was sharp, a mix of frustration and worry. On the other end, James's voice was cold but resolute. "Laura, we need to talk. There's no easy way to say this. The company, it's done. I've made some decisions." Her heart sank as the words hit her. "What do you mean, done, James? We're talking about everything, our life, our future, everything we've built. You've always been careful, always been the one who kept things together. Why now?" There was a long pause on the other end, and she could hear his slow, deliberate breathing. Finally, James spoke, his tone strangely detached. "I need you to trust me on this. I've made some changes, and I need to see if we're really a family. Not just because of the money, but because of us. Without the wealth, without the company, I want to know if we still matter to each other." Laura felt a chill crawl up her spine. She didn't understand. Why would he do something so drastic? Was this some kind of test? Her mind raced, trying to grasp the implications of his words. "James, she started, but he cut her off. "You'll see, Laura. You'll understand soon enough. I'm going away for a while. I need you to deal with this. You're strong. You've always been strong. I need to know if we're still strong together." Before she could respond, the line went dead. Laura stared at the phone in disbelief. Her hand trembled as she slowly lowered it to her side. What did he mean by that? What was going on? And why was he doing this? The room seemed to close in around her, the weight of the situation bearing down on her chest. She had thought. She knew James, his ambitions, his drive, his love for their family. But this felt like a betrayal. This felt like something deeper, something hidden beneath the surface. Back in the village, James stood by the window of his modest cabin, staring out at the setting sun. The sky was a deep red, streaked with purples and oranges, as if the world itself was reflecting his inner turmoil. He had taken the first step, shutting down the empire he had built. It was all falling apart, and for the first time, he felt truly alive. But with that feeling came a gnawing doubt. He had never felt so uncertain, so exposed. What would happen when Laura found out? What would happen to Emma and Jake? Would they still love him, or would they only see him as the man who had taken everything away? He couldn't bear the thought of them resenting him, of losing them forever. But he had to know. He had to see. If love could survive without the cushion of wealth and comfort, back in the city, things were spiraling. The news of the company's bankruptcy spread quickly through the media. Headlines flashed across screens. Billionaire James Weston declares bankruptcy, a shocking fall from grace. Financial analysts speculated about the reasons behind the sudden collapse, but no one had the full story. Laura, overwhelmed and in shock, had retreated to the study, trying to piece together what had happened. The children were in their rooms, confused and worried. She could hear Jake pacing down the hallway, but he didn't come into the study. He was as lost as she was. Laura's mind replayed the conversation she had with James over and over, the weight of his words, the cold finality in his tone. She couldn't comprehend why he had done this. The man she had loved, the man who had been her partner for so many years, was now a stranger. And the more she thought about it, the more hurt she felt. Her phone buzzed on the desk, pulling her from her thoughts. It was a message from Michael, James's assistant. "Mrs. Weston, I've just received confirmation that all assets have been liquidated. The company's funds are now in Mr. Weston's personal account. The official statement about the bankruptcy has been sent out to the press. The board will be meeting soon to discuss next steps. Please let me know if you need anything else." She stared at the message, the words blurring in front of her. How could he do this to them? To her? She had spent years supporting him, standing by his side through everything, and now he was testing her like this. Laura felt a lump rise in her throat. She wanted to scream, to demand answers, to tear apart everything that James had just destroyed, but she didn't. Instead, she took a deep breath and wiped away the tear that had slipped down her cheek. There was nothing she could do but face the reality of it all. How could she rebuild everything from the ruins he had left? Back in the small village, James couldn't sleep. His mind was racing with the consequences of his actions. He had always been the one to control every situation, but now he was powerless. The life he had known, the luxury, the security, was gone. But more than that, he was beginning to realize that the test he had set in motion was not just a test of his family, it was a test of himself. He had been so focused on his empire, so consumed by his success, that he had forgotten how to live for the things that truly mattered. He reached for the phone again, his fingers hovering over the dial. He could call Laura, explain everything to her, tell her he was sorry. But something held him back. He needed to know if their love could survive without the money, without the status. For the first time in years, he felt uncertain of his own actions. The days passed slowly, and with each tick of the clock, Laura felt the weight of James's actions settle deeper into her chest. The sudden collapse of the company, the disappearance of the wealth they had relied on for years, felt like a cruel game. But what hurt the most was the silence. The silence from James, the silence from the man she thought she knew. Laura spent her days managing the fallout. She had tried calling James multiple times, but each time she reached his voicemail. She had called Michael as well, but he was just as helpless. The messages from the press, the inquiries from the board members, everything felt like a snowball racing down a hill, gaining speed and size as it went. But none of it mattered in the face of the truth. James had done this. He had pulled the rug out from under them, and now she was left trying to put the pieces back together without any idea of where to even start. At the Weston mansion, Jake and Emma were grappling with the changes in their own ways. Jake, always quiet and introspective, had retreated into his room more often than not. He had become withdrawn, staring at his phone and scrolling through social media, trying to make sense of the stories flooding the internet. Emma, on the other hand, was far more vocal about her confusion. She had always been the more expressive of the two, and now she was channeling her anger into words. "Why would he do this?" Emma exclaimed, slamming her backpack onto the couch as she entered the living room. "How could Dad just destroy everything, without even talking to us first? He's supposed to be the one who takes care of us. He's always been the one to protect us. So why would he do this to us?" Laura stood by the window, staring out at the garden, though her mind was miles away. Emma's words stung, but she couldn't find the strength to argue. She felt just as lost as her daughter. She had no answers, no explanation. The only thing she could offer was silence. "I don't know, sweetie. I really don't know," Laura whispered, her voice barely audible. Emma collapsed onto the couch, her face buried in her hands. "We were fine, Mum. We were fine before all this, before he became obsessed with everything. But now I don't even know who he is anymore." Laura's heart ached. Emma was right. She had tried to stay strong, to keep things together for the sake of her children. But now it felt like the foundation of everything they had built together had been shattered. The man she had married was no longer the man she thought she knew. And the worst part, she wasn't sure if the man she had fallen in love with was ever truly there at all. James sat in his small, cluttered cabin, staring at the wall. The rustic charm of the place had once appealed to him, but now it felt like a prison. The weight of his decision pressed down on him like a heavy stone. His thoughts were consumed by doubt. He had come here to test his family, to see if they would still love him when everything else was gone. But now that he was here, alone with his thoughts, he was beginning to wonder if he had made a terrible mistake. The days of high-rise boardrooms, endless meetings and luxurious dinners with clients felt like a distant memory. The mansion, the cars, the private jets, all of it now felt empty. He had never realized how much he had come to rely on his wealth until it was gone. In his solitude, James found himself reflecting on his relationship with Laura, with Emma, with Jake. He had been so focused on building his empire that he had neglected the very people who had once been his entire world. How could he have let this happen? How could he have been so blind? The thought of his children, especially Jake, weighed heavily on him. He remembered when Jake was little, how the boy had looked up to him with admiration in his eyes. But now it felt like he had lost his connection to both of his children. Emma was angry and Jake was distant. He didn't know if he could ever repair what had been broken. And Laura, his heart twisted at the thought of her. He had always thought she was his anchor, the one person who understood him. But now, as the days passed without a word from her, he wondered if he had destroyed that too. Back at the Weston mansion, Laura felt like a shell of herself. She had spent hours pacing the house, trying to figure out what to do next. She couldn't just stand by and let everything fall apart. But what could she do? James had left them with nothing. The company was bankrupt. The mansion was now under siege by creditors, and the bank accounts that once seemed endless were now frozen. The life they had known was crumbling, and she didn't know how to stop it. She sat down at her desk and opened the drawer to find the envelope James had left for her, the one she hadn't had the courage to open until now. She had put it off for days, but now, as the weight of everything pressed down on her, she needed to face whatever message he had left. With trembling hands, she pulled out the letter and unfolded it. "Laura," the letter began, "by the time you read this, everything will have changed. I know this may seem like a betrayal, and maybe it is, but I need you to understand that this was never about destroying everything we built. It was about testing something more important, our love. I need to know if we can survive without the wealth, without the power. I need to know if you would still love me if I had nothing." Laura's heart pounded in her chest as she read his words. She felt a mixture of anger and heartbreak. He was testing them, testing their love. All of this, everything they had lost, was a game to him. The more she read, the more her chest tightened. "I'm sorry for everything, Laura. I never meant for it to come to this, but I need to know, please, don't hate me." The letter ended abruptly, as if James had been interrupted. Laura stared at the paper in disbelief. He had done all of this for a test? To see if their love was real? Her hands shook as she lowered the letter, the weight of the situation finally sinking in. She didn't know whether to scream or cry. She had never felt so betrayed, so helpless. As the days dragged on, the question remained. Was this really a test, or had James lost sight of everything that mattered, including the family he claimed to love? The days blended together in a haze for Laura. The whirlwind of financial turmoil, the pressure to maintain some semblance of normalcy for Emma, and Jake, and the constant barrage of questions from the media and creditors, all of it seemed to wash over her like an unrelenting tide. But through it all there was one thing that stood out, like a jagged rock amid the storm. The letter James had left behind. Her thoughts were consumed by his words. "I need to know if you would still love me if I had nothing." Laura sat in the living room late one evening, the house still and quiet except for the low hum of the refrigerator and the soft clicking of the clock on the wall. She couldn't sleep, couldn't stop thinking about everything that had changed. The mansion, once filled with laughter and warmth, now felt cold and hollow. It had been days since she'd last heard from James, and she felt the weight of the silence more than ever. She hadn't told the children the full truth. She wasn't sure how to. How could she explain the actions of a man they had always looked up to, a man who had always been their rock, now reduced to someone who had abandoned them in a moment of crisis? But there was one thing she was sure of. This wasn't the man she had married. The man who had stood by her side, who had promised to build a life together, wasn't the same man who had now left everything behind. Her mind wandered back to the early days of their marriage. She remembered when they had first met, how carefree and full of hope they had been. It wasn't about the money or the status back then. It was about love. She had believed all those years ago that love could conquer anything. But now she wasn't so sure. James, far away in his quiet cabin, couldn't shake the gnawing feeling that something had gone terribly wrong. The decisions he had made in the past few days seemed less like a bold experiment and more like an irreversible mistake. He thought he would find clarity, but instead, all he felt was emptiness. He had always believed that his wealth, his empire, was what made him who he was. But now, without it, he didn't know who he was anymore. The loneliness of the small cabin mirrored the emptiness inside him. He tried to distract himself, tried to focus on the silence around him, but nothing could drown out the questions that plagued him. Had he made the right choice? He had never wanted to hurt Laura, never wanted to cause her pain. But now, as he sat in the dim light of the cabin, he realized just how much damage he had done. This wasn't a test of love. It was a test of his own insecurities. He had wanted to know if Laura's love was real, but what he had forgotten was that real love didn't need tests. It was about trust, about partnership, and he had betrayed both. The following morning, Laura stood by the large windows of the mansion, looking out at the garden. It was a beautiful day, the sun bright and the sky clear, but inside it felt like a storm was brewing. Emma had gone out with her friends, and Jake was still holed up in his room. She couldn't help but feel the distance between them grow, the gap widening with every passing day. She needed answers. She needed to understand why James had done this, why he had pulled away from everything they had built. She had always known James to be strong, driven, focused, but this was a side of him she had never seen before. With trembling hands, she picked up her phone. She hadn't called him since the day of the letter, not knowing what to say, not sure if he would even pick up, but today she couldn't take it anymore. Her fingers hovered over his name and she pressed dial. The phone rang once, twice, then finally clicked to voicemail. "James," she said, her voice shaking slightly. "It's Laura. I need you to come home. We need to talk. Please. I need to understand why you've done this, why you've left us like this. Our family, it's falling apart, and I need to know if you're still with us. If you still want this, please call me." She hung up the phone, staring at the screen for a moment, hoping for a response. But the phone remained silent. Back in the village, James stared at the phone in his hand, the voicemail from Laura still fresh in his mind. He had listened to it several times, each time feeling his heart tighten in his chest. He wanted to call her back, to explain everything, but the fear of her response paralyzed him. The truth was, he didn't have an explanation that would make sense. How could he explain to her that he had been testing their love, testing the very foundation of their marriage? How could he admit to her that he had sacrificed everything they had worked for just to see if they could survive without it? The more he thought about it, the more foolish it seemed. He had thrown away everything, all because of his own insecurities. He wasn't sure if he could ever fix the mess he had made. Later that evening, Laura sat at the kitchen table, staring at the envelope that James had left her. The letter had been her only connection to him for days, and yet it seemed to only raise more questions. As the minutes ticked by, she found herself lost in thought again, trying to piece together the man she had once known and the stranger who had left her behind. Emma and Jake came down for dinner, but there was a somber air about the house. Neither of them spoke much. Emma was on her phone, scrolling through the latest news about the bankruptcy, while Jake sat quietly, his eyes distant. "Mom?" Jake spoke up, his voice soft but steady. "Do you think Dad will come back? Is everything going to be okay?" Laura felt her chest tighten. She wasn't sure if she could give him the answer he wanted. She wasn't sure if she even had an answer herself. "I don't know, sweetheart," she said, her voice heavy with uncertainty. "But we'll get through this, we always do." James sat at the small wooden table in his cabin, staring at the letter he had written to Laura. He had written it with the best of intentions, but now, as he read it over again, he saw only the hurt and confusion he had caused. He had wanted to test their love, but in doing so he had torn it apart. He reached for his phone again, but this time he didn't hesitate. He dialed Laura's number. The phone rang. James sat there, the phone pressed to his ear, the sound of the dial tone echoing in his mind. Each ring felt like an eternity. The moment he had feared for days was finally upon him. This was it. He had to face the consequences of his actions, and he couldn't run anymore. When the voicemail picked up, his heart sank. "I'm sorry, Laura, I should have never left you in the dark. I'm not sure how to fix this, but I need to try. Please, let's talk." He ended the call with a deep breath. He had been expecting anger, confusion, disappointment, but the voicemail hadn't come close to the words he wished he could say. What could he possibly say to undo the damage? How could he explain that his attempt at testing their love had torn their family apart? Back at the mansion, Laura had been standing by the window, looking out at the sprawling grounds. The view from the glass seemed almost surreal, like the world outside had nothing to do with the storm that raged within the walls of their home. She had been lost in her thoughts when the ringtone of her phone broke the silence. The number on the screen sent a jolt through her chest. It was James. Her hand hovered over the phone. Her first instinct was to ignore it, to continue to ignore the man who had left them all in the dark. But then she remembered the letter, the questions, the need for answers. Taking a steadying breath, she answered. "James," she said, her voice tight but resolute. There was a long pause before he finally spoke. "Laura, I don't know what to say. I don't know how to make this right." Her throat tightened, but she held her ground. "You can start by telling me why you did it. Why did you destroy everything we built together? Why did you throw us all away for some ridiculous test?" His voice cracked slightly. "It wasn't meant to hurt you. I didn't realize how much I would hurt you by doing this. I thought if I could strip away everything, I'd see if what we had was real. But it wasn't supposed to be like this." Laura shook her head, her grip tightening on the phone. "You don't get it, do you? Love isn't a test. Love is about trust. It's about standing together when things get hard. You didn't give us a choice, James. You just took everything away." James closed his eyes, feeling the weight of her words hit him harder than he expected. "I thought that without the money, without the wealth, we would be forced to focus on what really mattered," he said, his voice softening. "But now I realize that I was wrong. I thought if I took everything away, I would see if you would still love me for me. But I didn't consider the cost. I didn't think about what it would do to you, to Emma, to Jake." Laura's chest ached. Her mind raced, trying to find the words to express the hurt, the disbelief, the sadness she felt. But in the end, all she could manage was a quiet, "You've broken us, James." The silence on the other end of the line stretched, heavy and thick. "I'm so sorry, Laura. I never wanted to hurt you, but I did," James whispered, his voice full of regret. "I've been selfish, and now I don't know how to fix this." Back in the small cabin, James felt the full weight of his actions. The days he had spent here, isolating himself from everything, now felt like nothing more than a form of self-punishment. He had abandoned everything that mattered to him, his family, his marriage, the life they had built together. And for what? To prove some misguided point about his own worth? The truth was, he wasn't sure who he was without the wealth, without the empire. He had spent so many years building his success that he forgot to nurture the very relationships that made that success worth anything. And now, as he listened to Laura's voice on the phone, he realized how much he had lost. He wasn't sure if he could ever get it back, but he knew he had to try. In the mansion, Laura's thoughts were a whirlwind. She had never imagined this would be the outcome. When they had first met, she had believed that love could conquer all, that nothing could tear them apart. But now, as she stood at the precipice of everything she knew, she wasn't sure what was left to hold on to. The sound of footsteps interrupted her thoughts. Emma stood at the door, her face pale, her eyes red from crying. "Mom," she said, her voice soft and uncertain, "is everything going to be okay?" Laura took a deep breath, turning to her daughter. For a moment, she was unsure how to answer. What could she say to comfort Emma when she herself didn't have any answers? "I don't know, sweetheart," Laura said honestly, "but we'll get through this together. We have to." Emma nodded, wiping away the last of her tears. "I don't understand why Dad did this. He always said we were a family, that we'd always stick together, but now it feels like everything is falling apart." Laura reached for her daughter, pulling her into a tight hug. "I know, honey. I don't understand it either. But whatever happens, we'll figure it out. We're still a family, no matter what." Emma looked up at her mom, her voice barely a whisper. "Do you think Dad will come back?" Laura hesitated, not sure what to say, but then, looking into her daughter's hopeful eyes, she gave a small nod. I think he might be trying. I hope he is. But no matter what happens, we'll be here. We'll be okay." James stood in the cabin, staring at the phone for a long moment. The conversation with Laura had opened up a flood of emotions he had been trying to bury for days. He had hoped for clarity, for understanding, but all he had found was more confusion. Was it too late to fix this? He walked to the window, staring out at the vast empty land around him. The silence was deafening. For the first time since he had arrived here, he felt utterly alone. The days after the phone call passed slowly, each one blending into the next, like a dull, lifeless fog. Laura continued to go through the motions of her days, taking care of the children, trying to maintain some sense of normalcy, but everything felt off. The weight of James's actions still lingered heavily on her shoulders. There was no easy way to move past what had happened, no simple fix for the damage he had caused. She often found herself staring at the walls of their once beautiful home, wondering what had gone wrong. What had happened to the man she had married, the man she had believed in so completely? She had tried to speak to him again, but the calls and messages went unanswered. James had once been someone who took action, who was decisive. Now it felt as if he was lost, hiding away in that cabin, unable or unwilling to face the reality of the consequences of his actions. James, too, found himself trapped in his own mind. Each day in the cabin, surrounded by nothing but the empty wilderness, only served to remind him of how badly he had messed up. His heart ached with the absence of Laura's voice, the silence that stretched between them. The isolation was suffocating. He had been too proud, too obsessed with his own fear of inadequacy, and now he was paying the price. But no matter how much he thought about it, no matter how many times he replayed the events in his mind, he couldn't find a way back. He had spent so much of his life building his empire, thinking that wealth would prove his worth, not just to the world, but to himself. But now, with everything gone, he didn't know who he was anymore. The man who had been so certain of everything had become a shadow of himself. Meanwhile, back in the mansion, Laura's thoughts had started to shift. She had spent the last few days brooding, filled with a storm of conflicting emotions. The anger, the pain, the confusion, everything had been swirling around in her mind like a whirlpool. But something had changed. As much as she had been hurt by James's actions, a part of her, one she wasn't entirely proud of, missed him. She missed the man who had been her partner in everything, the one who had shared her dreams and ambitions. She missed their life, even if it had been built on a foundation of wealth and material success. But more than that, she missed the man who had once told her that he loved her above all else. One evening, as Laura sat on the edge of the couch, the silence in the house felt unbearable. The kids were in bed, and she had spent the entire day trying to put on a brave face. But as the evening stretched on, she knew that she couldn't keep pretending. The front door creaked open, and she looked up, expecting it to be one of the kids coming down for a glass of water or something. But instead, standing in the doorway, was a figure she hadn't expected, a figure that seemed to appear out of nowhere. James. She froze for a moment, her heart pounding in her chest. He stood there looking weary, almost broken, but he was there, finally, standing in the doorway, looking like he had been dragged through hell. James. Her voice faltered as she tried to process the sight of him. After all the days of silence, all the unanswered calls, he was here, yet she didn't know how to feel about it. "Laura," he said, his voice a hoarse whisper, "I know I don't deserve your forgiveness, and I don't expect things to go back to normal just like that," he continued, his eyes meeting hers. "But I couldn't stay away any longer. I've made so many mistakes, and I don't even know where to begin." Her mind raced, her emotions running wild. For a split second, she didn't know whether to scream, cry, or run away. But instead, all she could do was stare at him, her heart heavy with a mix of anger, confusion, and something she hadn't expected. Hope. "Why, James? Why didn't you talk to me? Why did you think this was the answer?" Laura's voice was shaky, but She couldn't hold back the flood of questions anymore. "Do you know what you've put me through? What you've put the kids through?" James swallowed hard, his eyes glistening with unshed tears. "I was selfish, Laura. I was so afraid of losing myself, of losing everything that I thought defined me. I thought if I could strip away the wealth, if I could take everything away, I'd know if you really loved me for me. But I was wrong. I lost sight of what matters most. I lost sight of you, of us, of the family we were supposed to be." He stepped forward cautiously, his eyes pleading for understanding. "I don't know if you can forgive me, but I need you to know that I'm here now and I'm ready to do whatever it takes to fix this." Laura felt her chest tighten, the rush of emotions threatening to overtake her. She hadn't expected him to return, let alone return with such raw honesty. She had spent so many nights wondering what it would be like when he finally came back, and now that he was here, she found herself at a loss for words. Her heart still ached with the memory of his absence, the loneliness she had endured, the uncertainty she had lived with. But as she stood there facing him, she realized something. She wasn't the same woman who had watched him walk away. She had changed. "I don't know if I can forgive you, James," she said slowly, her voice steady despite the turmoil inside. "You tore apart everything we had, you broke my trust, and I don't know how to rebuild that, but I'll try for us, for the kids. But you need to understand something. This can't just be about you anymore. You can't keep running from your mistakes." He nodded, the weight of her words sinking in. "I understand. I'm not running anymore. I'm here, Laura. I'm ready to face what I've done, no matter how hard it is." As they stood there in the dim light of the living room, there was a shift between them, an unspoken understanding that while things would never be the same, they were both willing to try. There was no magic fix, no quick solution, but for the first time in a long time, they were both facing the reality of their situation together. It wouldn't be easy. It might never be the same as before, but for now they had taken the first step toward healing. The next few days felt like a delicate dance. Neither James nor Laura could ignore the deep wound between them, yet there was something tentative, something fragile about their attempts to reconnect. It was clear that the path forward would not be easy, if it was even possible at all. James spent his mornings in the study, reviewing his business plans. But the numbers and reports, once a source of comfort and power, now seemed utterly meaningless. He had spent years building his empire, thinking that success in the boardroom would translate into happiness at home, only to realize how deeply flawed that assumption had been. The quiet hum of the house no longer brought peace. Every corner, every room held echoes of what he had broken. He had put so much stock in material wealth that he had forgotten the real currency in life: love, trust, and family. And now he was paying the price. The hardest part was realizing that he couldn't fix it all in one grand gesture. It was going to take time, patience, and consistent effort. But even as he worked through the logistics of his next move, the one thing that filled his thoughts was Laura. Meanwhile, Laura was doing her best to maintain a sense of normalcy for their children. She cooked their favorite meals, made sure they kept up with their schoolwork, and put them to bed with gentle words and comfort. But inside, her mind was in turmoil. She wasn't sure what to do. Could she really forgive him? Could she trust him again after everything he had put her through? The hurt was still fresh, and every time she looked at James, she saw the man who had walked away from them, who had made the decision to test their love in the most devastating way. There was no easy way to erase that. But there was something. In his eyes now, something different. The same eyes that had once been full of pride and ambition now seemed filled with regret and vulnerability. He had changed, that much was clear. But would it be enough? One evening, after the kids had gone to bed, James sat down at the kitchen table, staring at the half-empty cup of coffee in front of him. He had been trying to find the right words to say to Laura, but every time he opened his mouth, it felt like he was fumbling through an impossible conversation. Laura walked in quietly, glancing at him as she poured herself a glass of water. The silence between them was palpable, as if the air itself was holding its breath. "James," she said finally, her voice breaking the stillness, "I've been thinking a lot, about everything, about you, about us, and I still don't know what to do." He looked up, his heart racing. "I understand. I know I don't deserve your forgiveness. But I need you to know I'm trying. I'm trying to prove to you that I'm here for you, that I'm here for the family." She sat down across from him, her fingers gently tracing the rim of her glass. "It's not just about you being here, James. It's about trust. It's about knowing that when things get tough, we can rely on each other. And I'm not sure. I know if I can rely on you anymore." Her words stung, but James couldn't argue with them. He had broken that trust, and there was no quick fix. The journey ahead would require more than just promises. It would take consistency, actions, and, above all, time. "I know I can't change the past," he said quietly, "but I'm willing to do whatever it takes to earn that trust back. I'll prove it to you day by day, even if it takes years. I'm not going anywhere." Laura's gaze softened just a fraction. It wasn't forgiveness, not yet. But it was something, a sliver of hope, perhaps. The following days were filled with small steps, awkward conversations, shared moments of silence, and the occasional tender gesture. James tried to be present, to show Laura that he was there for her, not just in body but in heart as well. He took on more of the household responsibilities, even though he was far from a natural at it. He cooked dinner a few times, helped with the kids' homework, and took the time to listen. But despite his best efforts, there was a distance between them, a barrier that had yet to be broken down. One afternoon, as James sat in the living room reading, his phone buzzed with a text message. It was from his lawyer. "We need to discuss the legal steps for restructuring the company. Are you still planning on shutting everything down?" James stared at the message for a moment. He had been so caught up in trying to salvage his family that he had almost forgotten about the mess his finances were in. The business empire that had once defined him was now on the verge of collapse. His heart sank as he realized the gravity of the situation. If he followed through with his plan to completely liquidate the business, there would be no turning back. He would lose everything he had built. But was it worth it? Later that evening, as he sat in front of the computer, James opened up the email from his financial advisor. The numbers on the screen made his stomach churn. If he went through with his plan, there would be no turning back. The mansion, the private jet, the cars, it would all be gone. His finger hovered over the keyboard, uncertain whether to pull the trigger. The decision was no longer about wealth or success. It was about what truly mattered. And he wasn't sure he had the answer. The doorbell rang, breaking James from his thoughts. It was Emma, looking more serious than he had ever seen her. "Dad, can we talk?" James stood up, surprised. "Of course, sweetheart. What's on your mind?" Emma walked into the room and sat down, her brow furrowed. "I know you and Mom are trying to figure things out, but I need to know, is everything going to be okay? Are we going to be okay?" Her words struck him like a lightning bolt. All. This time, he had been so focused on his own pain, his own guilt, that he hadn't stopped to consider how deeply this had affected their children. "I don't know, Emma," he said quietly, "but I promise you I'm going to do everything I can to make things right." Emma looked up at him, her eyes filled with both hope and fear. "I just want things to go back to the way they were," she whispered. James swallowed hard, a lump forming in his throat. "I wish I could promise you that, but I can't. I can't promise that things will ever be the same, but I can promise you this. I'm not giving up on us. I'll never give up." As the night stretched on, James couldn't help but feel the weight of his family's expectations pressing down on him. They had no idea the depth of the sacrifice he had made, how much he was willing to lose just to try and mend the damage he had caused. But it wasn't just about the money anymore. It was about finding his way back to them, back to Laura, back to the life they had shared. The road ahead would be long and uncertain, but for the first time in a long time, he felt a flicker of hope and hesitant steps toward healing. For James, the weight of his past mistakes hung heavily, casting a shadow over every action he took. He had tried to strip away everything in his life to test his family's loyalty, but now he realized that it was his own commitment that needed testing. He needed to prove that he could be more than just the man who built a business empire. He needed to be the man who could rebuild his family, one small step at a time. Every morning, he started with the same routine. He made breakfast for the Sunghids, an awkward attempt at reclaiming the role of a father he had neglected for so long. The scrambled eggs were a bit overcooked, and the pancakes were uneven, but the kids didn't seem to mind. They were just happy to have him around, even if he wasn't quite the same man he had been before. Laura watched from the doorway as he fumbled with the kitchen appliances. There was something endearing in his clumsy efforts, but it didn't erase the pain. It didn't erase the loss they had suffered. She knew that rebuilding their relationship would take time, but in the back of her mind doubts lingered. Was this just a phase for James? Would he eventually slip back into the habits that had led to their downfall in the first place? That afternoon, James sat at the kitchen table, staring at his phone. He had received another message from his lawyer, another reminder that the company was on the brink of collapse. The pressure was mounting, and the decision he had to make loomed over him like a dark cloud. He couldn't ignore it any longer. His wealth, his status, everything he had worked for, it was all hanging by a thread. The idea of letting go of everything was terrifying. He had built his life around this company, and yet, in a strange twist of fate, it was the very thing that had driven a wedge between him and the people he loved most. As he sat there, contemplating his next move, his phone buzzed again. This time it was a text from Laura. "We need to talk, it's important." His heart skipped a beat. What was it about this text that made his pulse race? Was she finally going to tell him what she was feeling? Was she going to lay it all out? Her anger, her hurt, her confusion, or perhaps this was the moment when she would finally open up about what it would take to fix things between them. He met Laura in the living room a short while later, her expression unreadable. She motioned for him to sit, her gaze never leaving his. "James, I've been thinking," she began, her voice steady. "I can't keep pretending that everything is okay when I know it's not. I've been watching you, trying to figure out if this is just another act, another phase where you're trying to prove something. But what I need from you, more than anything, is the truth." Her words hit him like a punch to the gut. The truth. She wanted the truth. And for the first time in a long time, he wasn't sure he had the answers. "I'm not asking for grand gestures, James," she continued, her voice softening slightly. "I'm not asking you to fix everything overnight, but I need you to be honest with me about who you are now, about what you want, and about whether or not you're willing to put your family first. Because if you're not, then I don't know how we can move forward." James swallowed hard, his throat tightening. He had spent so much time running from the truth, so much time avoiding the reality of his situation. But now, with Laura's eyes fixed on him, he realized there was no more room for excuses. "I'm trying," he said, his voice cracking slightly. "I'm trying to be the man I should have been all along. I know I've failed you, failed all of you, and I don't know if I can make up for it. But I swear, Laura, I will do whatever it takes to rebuild what we had. I'm not just doing this for me, I'm doing this for us, for the family." There was a long silence, one that felt like an eternity. Laura's eyes softened, but she didn't say anything at first. Instead, she simply looked at him, studying him carefully, as if weighing his every word. Finally, after what felt like hours, she spoke again. "I need time, James. I need to see that this is real, that you're not just doing this because you're scared or because you think it'll make everything right again. I need to see you change, not just your actions, but your heart. And right now, I'm not sure if I can see that." James nodded, the truth of her words sinking in. He had spent so much time trying to fix the outward appearance of his life, the wealth, the success, the public image. But now he realized that it was his heart that needed to change. "I understand," he whispered, feeling the weight of her words. "I'm not asking for your forgiveness right now. I'm just asking for a chance." The next few days passed slowly, each one filled with small steps forward and moments of doubt. James tried to keep his focus on the family, on doing the things that mattered. He spent time with the kids, listened to them, and helped them with their homework. It wasn't much, but it was a start. Laura, too, found herself reflecting. She saw the effort James was putting in, but she also knew that actions spoke louder than words. It wasn't enough to just show up. It wasn't enough to simply do the bare minimum. She needed to feel his commitment, his heart, his willingness to fight for their family. One evening, as James and Laura sat together after dinner, a silence fell between them. For the first time in a long time, they weren't surrounded by the chaos of the world outside. There were no deadlines, no meetings, no distractions, just the two of them sitting together sharing the same space. "I've been thinking," Laura said quietly, breaking the silence. "Maybe we need to take a break. Not from each other, but from everything else. Maybe we need to go away for a little while, just the two of us, to focus on us again, to remember why we're together." James looked at her, his heart swelling with a mix of relief and hope. "You mean leave everything behind?" "Yes," she said, nodding. "I think we both need that. A chance to reconnect without all the outside noise. It wasn't a permanent fix. It wasn't a guarantee that everything would be okay. But it was a step, a chance to pause, to reflect, and to remember what had brought them together in the first place. And for the first time in a long time, James allowed himself to hope. Maybe, just maybe, they could find their way back to each other. The decision to take a break from everything was a turning point for James and Laura. It wasn't the grand gesture of an extravagant vacation or an emotional reconciliation, but rather something simpler, a moment of quiet, a space where they could breathe away from the constant pressures of life and focus only on each other and their family. They chose a small cabin in the mountains, far removed from the glitz and glamour of the world James had built. The isolation was both daunting and refreshing. No phones ringing, no emails demanding immediate attention, no meetings to prepare for. Just the sound of the wind rustling through the trees, the crackling of the fire in the hearth, and the occasional laugh from their children as they explored the woods. It was the first time in months that James felt like he could truly let go. The weight of his past mistakes, the guilt, the fear of losing everything, began to lift, if only for a moment. The cabin, tucked away in its serene environment, was a temporary sanctuary where he could find clarity. But even in the tranquility of the mountains, the tension between James and Laura was palpable. They weren't pretending everything was perfect. They were still walking through the ashes of their past, trying to figure out how to rebuild what had been broken. One evening, after dinner, they sat on the porch, sipping tea as the sun began to set. The sky was painted in soft hues of pink and orange, and for the first time in a long while, James felt something resembling peace. "I used to think that fixing everything meant making big decisions, like shutting down the company or selling off assets," James said, his voice thoughtful. "But now I realize that the small things, the daily choices we make, those are the things that matter." Laura looked at him, her expression softening. "Like what?" "Like making the effort every day to be present," he replied. "Not just for you, but for the kids, for our family. It's about the quiet moments, the ones we used to take for granted." She nodded, staring at the distant horizon. "I agree," she said quietly. "But it's also about trust. I've been questioning whether I can trust you again. I know you're trying, but sometimes it feels like we're just going through the motions." James felt the sting of her words. He knew she was right. The hurt, the doubts, they didn't disappear just because he was making an effort. Trust, once broken, wasn't something that could be easily mended. "I'm not asking you to trust me overnight," he said, his voice steady. "I know it's going to take time, but I promise you, every day, I'm going to work on earning that trust back, not with words but with actions." The days in the cabin passed slowly. The children reveled in the freedom of the outdoors, their laughter filling the air as they hiked and explored. James and Laura spent time together, sharing quiet conversations and moments of vulnerability. It wasn't perfect, but it was a start. On the fourth day, James took a long walk alone in the woods, his mind racing with thoughts of what lay ahead. The company was still a looming issue, and he knew he couldn't ignore it much longer. But for the first time in a while, he felt a clarity he hadn't experienced in years. The mountain air seemed to clear the fog in his mind. As he walked, he found himself at the edge of a small lake. The water was calm, reflecting the beauty of the surrounding landscape. He sat down on a large rock, gazing out at the serene scene. Before him, The quiet of the place was unsettling at first, but as he sat there longer it became soothing. There in the stillness, he found a strange sense of peace. It was as though the world had slowed down and he could finally breathe without the weight of his past decisions suffocating him. Later that evening, as they sat around the dinner table, the atmosphere was lighter. The tension between James and Laura had eased, if only for the moment. They laughed together, shared stories, and even allowed themselves to relax. It wasn't the grand reconciliation James had imagined, but it was something more genuine. It was progress. After dinner, as the children went to bed, Laura and James found themselves alone again. The silence between them was less awkward now, more comfortable. James reached for her hand, his fingers brushing against hers. "I don't have all the answers," he said quietly, "but I know I don't want to lose you. I don't want to lose us." Laura looked at him, her gaze soft but uncertain. "I don't want to lose us either. But it's going to take more than just saying the right things, James. It's about showing up every day." "I will," he promised. "Every single day." That night, as James lay awake staring at the ceiling, he thought about everything he had lost. The wealth, the status, the business, it was all just stuff. What mattered now was his family. Laura, the kids, they were his world. And if he was going to rebuild, it had to start with them. It had to start with the way he showed up, the way he proved that he was committed to them. Not just in words, but in actions. The next morning, James made a decision. He would meet with his lawyer the following week and officially begin the process of restructuring the company. It was time to let go of the past and embrace a future that focused on what truly mattered. As he shared this decision with Laura over breakfast, she nodded, her expression thoughtful. "That's a big step," she said, "but I think it's the right one." James smiled, a sense of relief washing over him. For the first time in a long time, he felt like he was on the right path. It wouldn't be easy. There would be bumps along the way, and the road ahead was uncertain. But he was ready to face it, ready to put in the work to rebuild both his family and his life. As the days passed, James continued to make small but meaningful changes. He took on more responsibility at home, helping with the kids' school, projects, and spending quality time with Laura. He was present in a way he hadn't been before, and it made all the difference. Laura, too, began to soften. She still had her doubts, but she saw the effort James was putting in. She saw the man who was trying, truly trying, to be a better husband and father. It wasn't perfect, but it was real. As they sat together on the porch one evening, watching the sunset, Laura turned to James. "Do you think we can make it through this?" she asked, her voice full of uncertainty. James took a deep breath, his gaze fixed on the horizon. "I don't know, but I'm willing to try, for you, for us." And for the first time in a long time, both James and Laura allowed themselves to hope. The road ahead would be long and difficult, but it was a road they would walk together, one step at a time. The days in the cabin were both a balm and a burden. For James and Laura, the temporary escape had provided a quiet space to reconnect. But the real world was waiting just outside the cabin's door. With every passing day, the weight of the decisions they had to make loomed closer. As they returned home, the familiar hum of the city, the buzzing of emails, the ringing of phones, it all came rushing back. James felt a sense of anxiety tightening in his chest. He had spent weeks trying to rebuild his family, but now he had to face the reality of his crumbling empire. He hadn't told Laura the full extent of his plans. He hadn't told her about the pending decision regarding the company's future. His mind was torn between his family and the company he had built, and he wasn't sure which one needed him more. The first morning back at their house felt strange. Everything seemed the same, too much the same. The marble countertops in the kitchen, the sleek design of the living room, the immaculate decor. It all seemed cold, a sharp contrast to the warmth they had experienced in the mountains. James stood in the kitchen, staring at the coffee pot, unsure of where to start. Laura entered the room, her eyes scanning the space. "It's hard to believe we were ever gone," she said quietly. Her words carried a weight James hadn't expected. "I know," he replied, running a hand through his hair. "I've been thinking about what we talked about. I want to try to make things right, but I'm not sure where to begin." For the first time in a while, Laura seemed uncertain, almost hesitant. "James, I know you've been trying," she said softly, "but I can't help but feel like we're standing on the edge of something. I can see the effort, but I also see the old habits creeping back in." James felt the sting of her words, but he knew she was right. The temptation to fall back into his old life, the life of meetings, power and success, was always there, lurking in the background. But he didn't want to go back to that man. He couldn't. "I'm trying to stay grounded, Laura," he said, his voice quiet but firm. "I'm not going to let everything slip away again." She nodded, but James could see the doubt in her eyes. He understood it, and in a way, it mirrored his own. How could he prove to her that he had truly changed? The following days were a blur of phone calls, meetings, and preparations. James hadn't fully committed to his decision regarding the company, but the pressure was mounting. The longer he delayed, the more the situation seemed to spiral out, of control. But then came a moment that made him realize the gravity of his situation. One evening, after a particularly long day, James sat alone in his office, staring at the piles of paperwork on his desk. The world outside was quiet, but his mind was anything but. He reached for his phone and dialed the number of his lawyer. "We need to talk," he said, "about the company. It's time to make some decisions." The next morning, James sat down with Laura to tell her what he had been wrestling with. He knew it was going to be hard. He had been avoiding this conversation for too long, but it was time to face it. "I've made a decision," he began, his voice steady but filled with tension. "I'm going to let the company go. I can't keep running from it. It's time to face the truth." Laura's eyes widened, surprise flickering across her face. "James, are you sure? I mean, we've built this life from the ground up, everything we have." "I know," he interrupted gently, "but I've realized that what's more important now is us, my family, you. I've spent so many years chasing something that doesn't matter as much as I thought it did." For a moment, Laura just stared at him, her mind racing. "So what now? Are we just going to walk away from everything?" James took a deep breath, trying to find the right words. "I don't know exactly what comes next, but I know that we have. So I chance to start over, to build something that actually matters, something real." They spent the next few days discussing the future. It was clear that they had both been running from different things, James from the failure of his empire, Laura from the hurt and distrust that had taken root between them. But for the first time in a long time, they both felt like they were on the same page. But old ghosts have a way of resurfacing even when you try to bury them. That evening, James received an unexpected visitor. It was his former business partner, Greg. James had known Greg for years, and the two had built the company together from the ground up. But their relationship had soured in recent years, and their partnership had ended badly. Greg's appearance at James's doorstep was unsettling. "What are you doing, James?" Greg asked as soon as James opened the door. "You're making a huge mistake, letting go of everything you've built. You're going to regret this." James felt the weight of his former partner's words pressing against him, but he remained calm. "It's not about the company anymore, Greg," he said, his voice firm. "It's about my family. It's about finding something that actually matters." Greg laughed bitterly. "You really think you can walk away from this? From all that we've built together?" "I'm not walking away," James replied. "I'm just choosing something different, something better." Greg left in a huff, but his words lingered in James's mind. It was easy to see why Greg was angry. The company they had built together had been their life's work, and for James to walk away from it seemed like a betrayal. But James knew that it was the right thing to do. When he told Laura about the visit, she listened quietly, her expression thoughtful. "People don't let go of things like that easily," she said finally. "But I think you're doing the right thing, James, and I'm proud of you for choosing us." Over the next few weeks, James began to take the necessary steps to wind down the company. It wasn't easy, and there were moments of doubt, but he remained committed to his decision. The process was long and complicated, but it was also freeing. The weight that had hung over him for so long began to lift as he focused more on his family and less on the demands of his former life. In the midst of all this, there were moments of genuine connection. James and Laura spent more time together, talking, laughing, rediscovering the intimacy they had lost. The kids, too, seemed to thrive in the new, calmer environment. James felt like he was finally becoming the father he had always wanted to be, and slowly but surely, Laura's trust in him began to rebuild. As the days went by, James realized that this new beginning wasn't just about leaving behind his past. It was about embracing a future filled with possibility. A future where his family, not his wealth, would be at the center of his world. As the weeks went by, the changes in James and Laura's life were becoming more tangible. The house, once filled with the hum of business calls and endless meetings, was now quieter, calmer. Their home had started to feel like a sanctuary rather than a symbol of success or achievement. The company James had spent his life building was winding down, and he was beginning to see the true weight of the decision he had made. But despite the physical quiet, the emotional turbulence still lingered. For every step forward they took, there seemed to be a new challenge waiting just around the corner, and even though they were both trying, there were moments where the ghosts of their past, of misunderstandings, betrayals, and silence, reared their ugly heads. One morning, after a particularly difficult night of quiet tension between James and Laura, James decided to take action. It was a small step, but it was a start, a decision to truly show up for his family in the way he knew he needed to. James walked into the kitchen, where Laura was sitting with a cup of coffee, the light from the morning sun spilling in through the windows. He could see the exhaustion on her face, the way her shoulders seemed weighed down by the burden of their past. He took a deep breath and sat down beside her, not rushing to say anything, just allowing the moment to settle between them. "I've been thinking about how I can make this right," he said quietly, his voice sincere. "And I know it's going to take time, but I want you to know that I'm here. I'm really here, Laura. I'm not just physically present. I want to be emotionally present too." Laura didn't immediately respond. She just looked at him, studying his face, as though she was trying to decide whether or not his words were genuine. James understood the hesitation. He had let her down so many times before, and the scars from that weren't easy to erase. But then, after what felt like an eternity, Laura reached over and took his hand in hers. "I know you're trying, James, and I appreciate that. But trust isn't something I can just give back easily. It's going to take time. It's going to take more than just words." James nodded. "I know, and I'm okay with that. I'll keep showing up, every day, because that's the only way I know how to prove to you that I'm serious." Later that afternoon, James took a walk around the property. The calmness of the landscape, the tall trees, the soft breeze, the rolling hills had always provided a sense of peace for him. But today the beauty of it all felt bittersweet. He had so much to atone for: the years of neglect, the moments he had missed, the love he had taken for granted. And while he couldn't change the past, he could do his best to shape the future. Over the next few days, James began to implement small changes. He started helping more around the house, making an effort to be more involved in the children's lives. He spent time with them, whether it was playing board games, helping with homework, or just sitting together and talking. He had missed so many of these small moments in the past, and now he was determined to make up for lost time. Laura, too, seemed to soften, though her wariness remained. She observed the changes, but she was still guarded. She wasn't ready to fully trust him yet, and James knew that was something he couldn't rush. He had to earn it back piece by piece, but there was progress. Small, subtle shifts. They started talking more openly, not just about the past, but about their hopes for the future. They laughed more. They argued less. And slowly, as the days passed, James began to feel like they were on the right track. One evening, after putting the kids to bed, James and Laura sat together on the couch, sharing a bottle of wine. The air between them was less tense than it had been in months. The conversation flowed easily, and for the first time in a long time, James felt like he could breathe without the constant weight of guilt pressing down on him. "I've been thinking," Laura began, her eyes meeting his. "I've been thinking about what we talked about, the future, and I think I'm ready to start letting go of the anger I've been holding on to." James felt his heart skip a beat. It wasn't an easy thing for her to admit, and the vulnerability in her voice made him pause. "Laura, you don't have to—" "I know I don't have to," she interrupted. "But I want to. I think I've been holding on to so much pain for so long that it's kept me from seeing what we could be." James reached for her hand, his voice full of gratitude. "I don't deserve your forgiveness, but I'm willing to work for it. And I'll keep showing you that I'm here. For real this time." Laura smiled, a genuine warmth in her eyes. "I can see that." As the days turned into weeks, the weight of their past began to feel a little lighter. James was still working through the complex process of letting go of his empire, and there were moments when the pressure felt overwhelming. But he had something now, something that mattered more than any amount of money or success. He had his family, and that made all the difference. It wasn't easy. They weren't fixed. There were still moments of doubt, of hurt, of setbacks. But for the first time in a long time, both James and Laura were committed to the journey. They were committed to healing, to rebuilding, and most importantly, to each other. And while there were still scars to heal, there was hope. Hope that they could emerge from this stronger. Hope that together they could create a new story, one that wasn't defined by the past, but by the promise of a better future. Despite the strides they had made, life had a way of testing James and Laura's newfound peace. The tension that had plagued their marriage for years didn't just evaporate because of a few good conversations. It was still there, lurking beneath the surface, threatening to unravel the progress they had made. One evening, a phone call from James's lawyer rattled him. The decision to dissolve his company was no longer just a decision, it was becoming a reality. The weight of the paperwork, the contracts, the impending fallout, it was all starting to sink in. James sat in the living room, staring at the phone in his hand. The news felt almost surreal, even though he had made the choice himself. It was go step into the unknown, a leap of faith that both terrified and excited him. But even though he knew it was the right thing to do, he couldn't shake the feeling of impending loss. This company, which had once been his entire world, was about to vanish, and with it a piece of himself. Laura walked into the room, sensing the shift in the air. "James?" Her voice was soft but concerned. "I just got off the phone with—" "My lawyer," he said, his voice tense. "It's really happening. The company, it's going to be gone soon." Laura didn't say anything at first. She walked over and sat beside him, taking his hand gently in hers. "I know this is hard for you," she said quietly. "I know it's been your dream, but you're doing the right thing." James squeezed her hand, but doubt lingered in his chest. "I keep thinking about all the people who are going to be affected, the employees, the shareholders. I feel like I'm abandoning them. And maybe I am." Laura shook her head slowly. "James, you're not abandoning anyone. You're choosing something better. You're choosing us. You're choosing a life that's more than just work, more than just success. And that's the kind of life we both deserve." Her words were comforting, but they didn't completely dispel the storm inside of him. For so long his worth had been tied to his business, his empire. Letting it all go felt like losing a part of his identity. As the next few days passed, James couldn't shake the feeling that he was standing at the edge of something, a precipice. That could either lead to a brighter future or send him tumbling into the unknown. The process of shutting down the company wasn't just about money. It was about every relationship he had built over the years, every decision that had led to this moment. He spent hours on the phone, working through the details, informing his employees and partners. It was a messy, heartbreaking process, filled with phone calls from angry stakeholders and disappointed investors. They didn't understand his decision, and many of them questioned his sanity. Some even accused him of throwing away everything he had worked for. But no matter how many angry calls he took, no matter how many sleepless nights he spent on the phone, one thing kept him going: Laura. She was there, always by his side, reminding him why he had made this choice in the first place. One evening, after another long day of business calls, James sat down with Laura in the kitchen. The house was quiet, the kids asleep upstairs, and for the first time in a while they had a moment to themselves. "James," Laura said, breaking the silence, "I know this is hard, but you have to remember, this isn't just about the company. It's about us, and you're doing the right thing. You've already given up so much for this for us. James met her gaze, and for the first time in weeks he felt a sense of peace. I don't want to lose you, Laura. I don't want to go back to the person I was. You won't, she assured him. You're already changing. You're already showing up day after day, and that's all I need. The weeks that followed were a blur of final meetings, legal paperwork, and heartfelt goodbyes. The reality of closing his business was sinking in deeper each day. As much as James had known in his heart that this was the right choice, it didn't make it any easier. There were days when the weight of it all felt unbearable, when he questioned if he was making the right decision. But he always had Laura beside him, reminding him of the bigger picture. And slowly they began to rebuild their lives, not around the success of a company, but around the love they had for one another and their children. One day, as they were sitting together in their living room, Laura turned to him with a thoughtful expression on her face. "James," she began, "we've come a long way, and I know it's been hard, but I think I'm finally ready to trust you again. I'm ready to move forward with you." James felt a lump form in his throat. "You—" "Are?" She nodded. "I've seen the changes in you. I've seen the way you're working on yourself, and I'm proud of you. I know it's going to take time for everything to heal, but I'm ready to try." Tears welled up in James's eyes. "Thank you, Laura. Thank you for giving me this chance. I promise I won't let you down." With each passing day, James felt the weight of the past lift a little more. The healing wasn't instant, and the road ahead was still long, but they were on it together. And that, for James, was more than enough. As the company's final paperwork was filed and the dust began to settle, James looked at his family, his heart swelling with gratitude. He had lost so much: money, status, and a part of himself. But in the process, he had gained something far more valuable: the chance to rebuild, to heal, and to start again. And for the first time in a long time, James felt at peace with his decision. The future wasn't certain, but it was filled with hope, and that was all he needed to take the next step. The weeks after James's decision to dissolve his company were filled with a mixture of uncertainty and hope. It wasn't just the business he was letting go of. It was the life he had known. For so long, the comfort of familiarity that came with wealth and success. But as he stood alongside Laura, facing the quiet home they now shared, James realized that what he was building was more than just a new beginning. It was a second chance. Laura had been patient with him, but that patience had limits. They were walking a delicate line. Every moment of progress seemed countered by moments of doubt, moments of confusion. There were still evenings when the weight of their past came rushing back, when the years of neglect and emotional distance seemed to hover in the air like a dark cloud. James knew the damage was far from healed, and it would take more than grand gestures or good intentions to fix it. But he was determined. Every day, he took small steps, constantly reminding himself that this wouldn't be a quick fix. He had to prove over and over again that he was willing to change. One evening, James sat at the kitchen table, poring over some legal documents. His eyes were tired, and his mind felt heavy from the constant demands of wrapping up his former business. But despite the exhaustion, there was a sense of calm he hadn't experienced in a long time. He was no longer chasing after success for the sake of it. There was nothing left to prove. Laura walked in quietly, a cup of tea in her hands. She placed it in front of him without a word and sat down across from him, her gaze soft but thoughtful. "I've been thinking," Laura said, breaking the silence. "About us, about what comes next." James looked up at her, his heart in his throat. He had braced himself for this conversation for weeks. "What are you thinking?" She met his eyes, a quiet strength in her voice. "I know you're doing everything you can to rebuild, to prove that this time it's different. But it's not just about you, James, it's about us. It's about what we both need. And I think we need to find a way to reconnect. Not just as husband and wife, but as people." James nodded slowly. "I know I've been focused on fixing everything that's broken, but I haven't given us the time to just be, to enjoy each other again." Laura's eyes softened. "That's the part we've lost, isn't it? The enjoyment, the ease, the way we used to laugh together, without the weight of the world on our shoulders." James took a deep breath, feeling the sting of her words. I want that back. I want to find a way back to that too. But I need you to be patient with me. I know I've made mistakes and I can't fix everything overnight. She reached out, placing her hand over his. I'm not asking for perfection, James. I'm asking for effort. And I need to see that you're really here, that you're not just doing this because you feel guilty, but because you want to, because you're willing to work on us. In the days that followed, James began to take her words to heart. He knew that the journey ahead wasn't just about fixing the cracks in their marriage. It was about learning to rebuild something new, something that was stronger and more resilient than before. He started making small gestures, leaving work, early to spend time with Laura, taking her out on spontaneous dates, and even doing little things around the house without being asked. He was learning, slowly but surely, to prioritize their relationship over everything else. But more than that, he was learning to listen, to truly listen to her when she spoke, to understand the depth of her pain and her hopes. He could feel the distance between them slowly closing, but it was fragile. It would take time, patience, and dedication. One evening, as they sat on the couch together, the children playing quietly in the background, Laura turned to James, her face illuminated by the soft glow of the living room lights. You've been making an effort, James, she said, her voice steady but full of warmth. And I see that. I see that you're trying. I can feel it. James felt a knot loosen in his chest, but there was still a long road ahead. I don't expect you to forgive me right away. I don't expect everything to be perfect, but I promise you this. This time, I'm here for real. I'm here for us. Laura smiled softly, her eyes filled with understanding. I know. And I'm willing to try too. I'm willing to trust again. But it's going to take time. We both need time. James had no illusions about the path ahead. He knew there would be setbacks, moments of doubt and challenges. But for the first time in a long time, he felt like they were on the right track. He wasn't trying to fix the past anymore. He was building something new. And while it wasn't going to be easy, he was willing to do the work every day to make it last. The days passed in a blur of small victories. Laura and James found themselves laughing together more often, the tension that had once choked their relationship beginning to dissipate. They still had their struggles. There were difficult conversations and moments of vulnerability. But they were facing them together. And slowly, over time, they began to see the fruits of their labor. Their connection deepened, and the bond that had once been frayed began to strengthen. It was like rebuilding a bridge, slowly, carefully, one piece at a time. One night, as they lay in bed, James pulled Laura close, his arms around her in a way that felt natural again. He kissed her forehead gently, his heart full of gratitude. Thank you, he whispered, for giving me this chance, for believing in me. Laura smiled softly in the darkness. Thank you for showing up, James, for really showing up. And for the first time in a long time, James felt like everything was exactly where it was supposed to be. With each passing day, James and Laura's relationship began to heal. It wasn't instantaneous, nor was it without struggle, but there was progress. The cracks they once tried to ignore had now been filled with understanding, patience, and love. Still, there was an overwhelming realization between them. Things couldn't just go back to how they were before. They had both changed, and their love had to evolve as well. One evening, after a long day of errands, James and Laura found themselves sitting in their cozy kitchen. The house was quiet, the kids off to bed, and the dim lights cast a warm glow around the room. They hadn't had much time for each other lately. Life had been busy with the transition from his business to a more simple life. But tonight, they had made time just for them. James looked over at Laura, his gaze softening as he took a sip of his coffee. I've been thinking a lot about the future, he said, breaking the silence. Laura raised an eyebrow, setting her teacup down. What about it? The future of us, of our family, what we want out of life now that we've let go of all the things that used to define us, money, success, status. I want us to build something real, something lasting. But I can't. Do it alone. Laura smiled, her eyes twinkling with a mixture of love and admiration. I think we're already on our way there. We're doing it, James. One day at a time. James reached for her hand across the table, the familiar warmth of her touch grounding him. He hadn't realized how much he'd missed this, how much he had taken it for granted. I just want to make sure that no matter what, I don't lose you again. I want us to be strong, not just as a family, but as partners. I want to be the kind of husband you deserve. Laura squeezed his hand. You're already doing that, every day. It's not about grand gestures, James. It's about being present, about showing up for each other when it counts. And I see that in you now. I see you trying, and that means everything. Though things were steadily improving, James still wrestled with guilt. The decision to shut down his business and walk away from everything he had worked for felt like a double-edged sword. He'd chosen this life, this simpler life. But there were moments when he questioned if it was the right choice. Was he making the right sacrifices? Was he doing enough for his children? For Laura? One afternoon, as he sat in his makeshift office, no longer the bustling headquarters he once oversaw, he received a phone call that would change everything. James, it's Alan. The voice on the other end of the line crackled. I know you've stepped away from the company, but we've hit a snag. There's an opportunity to turn things around, but we need you, your expertise, your leadership. The words echoed in James's mind. The temptation to return, to regain. What he had lost was strong. For a split second he was tempted to say yes, but then he thought about the life he was building with Laura, with his kids. He thought about how far they had come. I can't do it, Alan, he said, his voice steady. That chapter of my life is over. I've made a choice and I'm sticking with it. I'm building something better now, something that's about more than just profit, something that's about family. And that's what matters to me now. As the days wore on, James's resolve solidified. His business may have been his identity for years, but now it was just a part of his past, a painful but necessary part of who he was, and he had learned from it. His family, however, was the future, one he was determined to protect and nurture. But even as he made peace with his decision, the question remained. How would the world see him now? Would his friends, his old colleagues, his former investors ever respect him for stepping away from it all? Or would they view him as a failure? He found himself wrestling with those thoughts on a daily basis, but as he stood by the window one night, watching the sun set over the horizon, he realized something profound. The approval he once sought from the world was no longer important. The approval he needed now came from within, and from Laura, from the children they were raising together. That was enough. Meanwhile, life in the small town they had relocated, too, was settling into a rhythm. James and Laura had found a quiet house in a picturesque neighborhood, surrounded by nature and friendly neighbors. The kids were thriving in their new schools, and the slower pace of life allowed them to appreciate the little things, a walk through the park, a cozy dinner, and evenings spent together without the stress of deadlines and meetings. One weekend, the family took a trip to the local farmers' market, something they had never had the time to enjoy before. They wandered from stall to stall, sampling fresh fruit, homemade jams, and handcrafted goods. For James, it was a reminder of how far they had come, how simple and beautiful life could be when you stopped chasing things that didn't truly matter. As the days turned into weeks, James and Laura continued to rebuild their relationship. They learned to communicate more openly, to express their needs and desires without fear of judgment. They made time for each other, even in the midst of their busy schedules, and most importantly, they didn't let the past dictate their future. 1. Evening, as they sat together on their back porch watching the stars, James turned to Laura. I can't believe how far we've come. I can't believe this is our life now. Laura smiled, her fingers intertwined with his. I can. I always knew we could get here. It just took time, and patience, and a little bit of faith. James pulled her close, his heart full. I'm never going back to who I was before. This is everything. Despite the progress James and Laura had made, life had a way of throwing unexpected challenges in their path. They had learned to take things one step at a time, but not every day felt like a victory. With every new obstacle, James was reminded that true growth and change required continuous effort. One early morning, James received a letter. It was from the attorney handling his former company's dissolution. He opened it slowly, his heart skipping a beat. The letter contained unexpected news. A former investor had filed a lawsuit, claiming a portion of the assets that had been transferred during the shutdown. The amount was significant, and the situation was far more complicated than he had anticipated. Laura was standing by the kitchen counter when he entered. "James, what's wrong?" He handed her the letter, feeling the weight of the situation settle in his chest. She read it in silence before looking up at him, her eyes wide. "I thought everything was done," she said quietly. "I thought we were finished with this." "We were," James replied, rubbing his temples. "But it looks like this is a complication we weren't expecting. The lawsuit was a blow." For a moment, James felt his old instincts kick in, the desire to fight, to reclaim what was being taken from him. The familiar pull of the corporate world was there, like an old friend offering a hand. But as he looked at Laura, the weight of the decision was clear. The fight was no longer about money, power, or success. It was about what he was willing to sacrifice. Later that day, James sat in the living room, his thoughts consumed by the letter. Laura was in the kitchen, preparing dinner, but James couldn't shake the feeling of dread that had settled in his stomach. This wasn't just about business anymore. It was about his family, his future. His mind raced. The old James, the one who had once navigated high-stakes deals and the pressure of his empire, would have dived into this lawsuit head first. He would have fought for every penny, for every shred of power. But the new James, the one who had left, all that behind, knew better. When Laura joined him in the living room, she could sense the tension in the air. "Talk to me, James." "What are you thinking?" she asked softly. James took a deep breath and finally said, "I'm thinking about what we're willing to risk to protect the life we've built here. Do I fight this? Do I dive back into the world I walked away from? Or do I let it go, trust that we've built enough to withstand this storm?" That night they talked long into the evening. The conversation wasn't easy, but it was necessary. Laura, ever the voice of reason, reminded James that they had chosen a simpler, more meaningful life. They had given up so much to be here. Was it worth it to risk everything by re-entering a world that had caused so much harm in the past? "I don't want to go back, James," Laura said, her voice steady but firm. "I don't want to see you get consumed by that world again. We've worked so hard to get here. I know this lawsuit is a setback, but we've faced bigger challenges together. Let's not let this pull us back into a place we don't want to be." James listened to her words, feeling a deep sense of peace wash over him. Laura was right. The old world, the one filled with power struggles and constant pressure, had taken so much from him. It had cost him his connection with her, with his children, with his own sense of self. He had made the decision to let go, to be a different person, and he wasn't about to let this lawsuit undo all the progress they had made. The next morning, James called his attorney and decided not to engage in a lengthy legal battle. Instead, he chose to settle the matter quietly, agreeing to a minimal payment to resolve the dispute. It wasn't about winning or losing. It was about ensuring that the peace he had found with Laura and their children wasn't shattered. The final details of the settlement were completed. James felt a weight lift from his shoulders. He had made the right choice. He wasn't going to let the mistakes of his past define him anymore. His future was here with his family in this small town, living a life built on trust, love, and commitment. That evening, as they sat together in the kitchen, James reached for Laura's hand. "Thank you," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "Thank you for reminding me what really matters. I almost lost sight of that." Laura smiled gently, squeezing his hand. "We're in this together, James, and we always will be." Their conversation that night marked a turning point. James realized that, while challenges would always come their way, they were now equipped to handle them, not through wealth, not through power, but through the strength of their relationship and their commitment to each other. Together, they could face anything. In the days that followed, James and Laura focused on what truly mattered. They spent more time together as a family, making memories and enjoying the simplicity of life. James took on small projects around the house, fixing things that had been neglected for years. It was a reminder that while the world may continue to test them, their bond was unshakable. One evening, as they sat on the porch, watching the sun dip below the horizon, James reflected on the journey they had taken. "I never thought I'd be here," he said softly. "I never thought this life would be the one that would bring me peace." Laura leaned into him, her head resting on his shoulder. "Sometimes the life we think we want isn't the one that's best for us, but I believe we've found the right one. Together." James smiled, his heart full. Together. Though James and Laura had found peace in their new life, not everything had been resolved. There were still lingering feelings from the past, unanswered questions, and unspoken truths that were waiting to be addressed. Both had made tremendous progress, but there was an undeniable weight in the air, an elephant in the room they couldn't quite ignore. It was a quiet Sunday afternoon when it all came to a head. James was in the backyard fixing the fence that had been damaged during a recent storm. He had always found peace in the physical labor, the steady rhythm of hammering nails, the smell of fresh-cut wood. But today his mind wasn't on the fence. It kept drifting to the past, to his former life, the life of power, money, and endless competition. It was hard not to think about it, especially after the lawsuit and the way he had almost been pulled. Back in, Laura was inside, sitting at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee, looking out the window. Her gaze was distant, and James noticed that she seemed to be lost in thought. He had seen this look before, the look she wore when something was on her mind, something she hadn't yet shared with him. He wiped his hands on his jeans and walked into the house. "Laura," he said softly. She turned to face him, offering a small smile, but it didn't quite reach her eyes. "Hey, James." There was a brief pause before James spoke again. "You've been quiet lately. Is something bothering?" "You?" Laura hesitated, her fingers tracing the rim of her coffee cup. It's been a lot, James. I know you've been through a lot with the business and everything, but sometimes I wonder if we've really addressed everything that happened before. I mean, before all this. Before the change. I don't want to bring it up, but I don't want us to avoid it either. There are things I think we both need to say to each other." James felt a pang in his chest. He had known this conversation was coming. After everything they had been through, there were things they had both pushed down, feelings of hurt, anger, and betrayal. They had rebuilt their life together, but had they truly rebuilt their relationship? "I agree," he said, his voice steady. "I know I've done a lot of things in the past that hurt you, and I'm not proud of them. I've tried to move forward, but I don't want to leave things unresolved between us." Laura set her coffee cup down and met his eyes. "It's not just about what you did, James. It's also about what I did. The way I distanced myself. I shut myself off from you because I couldn't deal with the man you became. I couldn't deal with how much you changed, how much you were consumed by work, by success. I thought I could live with it, but I couldn't. And I think I've been punishing myself ever since." The conversation was raw, emotional, and difficult. It was the kind of conversation they had avoided for so long because it hurt too much, because facing the truth felt like it might unravel everything they had worked for. But as the hours passed, they slowly, carefully laid their feelings on the table. There were tears, apologies, and moments of silence, but there was also understanding. A deep, genuine understanding of how far they had come and how much farther they still had to go. Later that evening, as the sun dipped behind the mountains, James took a moment to reflect. He had spent so much time trying to fix everything, his business, his family, his identity, that he had never truly addressed the core of the issues. It wasn't just about what had happened in the past. It was about understanding each other in the present. It was about honesty, vulnerability, and trust. He walked out to the porch where Laura sat, looking out at the stars. He joined her silently, and they sat there together, side by side. No words were needed in that moment. The weight of the past had been acknowledged, and the healing had begun. "I love you, Laura," James whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "I'm so sorry for everything I put you through. I don't want to keep making the same mistakes." Laura turned to him, her eyes soft. "I love you too, James, and I'm not going anywhere. We'll work through this together. We've been through worse and we've come out stronger. This is just another step." It was in that quiet, peaceful moment that James truly understood the depth of his transformation. It wasn't about the riches he had given up or the business he had walked away from. It was about what remained: his family, his wife. The love and connection that, despite all the turmoil, had never truly gone away. They were both learning to be vulnerable, to face their past, and to rebuild what had been broken. It wasn't going to be easy, but it was worth it. Every step forward, no matter how small, was progress. The days that followed were filled with more conversations, more honesty, and more healing. James and Laura grew closer, not just because they had forgiven each other, but because they were learning to understand each other on a deeper level. They both realized that their relationship wasn't about perfection. It was about acceptance and growth. They also began to make plans for the future together. James had spent so many years focused on his career that he had neglected to truly imagine what kind of life he wanted beyond the business. But now, with Laura by his side, he was ready to dream again. They talked about opening a small bed and breakfast, maybe in a few years, or even taking a trip together to explore the world. For the first time in a long time, James felt truly alive. His past no longer defined him. He was no longer the man who chased money and success at the expense of everything else. He was the man who had found peace, who had learned to love deeply and to live authentically. As they sat together that evening, under the vast, starry sky, James knew that the future, whatever it held, would be filled with hope, and this time he wouldn't face it alone. As the days went by, James and Laura continued to rebuild their relationship, but even in the quiet moments of peace, life had a way of throwing unexpected challenges their way. While they had confronted their past, there was still one lingering question that neither of them had fully addressed. What would the future look like for them? James had made peace with his past, but he hadn't yet decided what to do with his wealth. The decision weighed on him. After all, it wasn't just about him anymore. It was about Laura, the children, and the life they had together. Could he ever truly walk away from the riches that had once defined him? Or had he finally outgrown them? It was a crisp morning in early spring when James and Laura sat at the kitchen table, sipping their coffee. The warm sun filtered through the windows, casting a golden light across the room. It was a peaceful scene, but underneath the calm surface, something was stirring. James couldn't ignore the nagging feeling that he was at another crossroads, one that would require him to make a decision that would define the rest of his life. "Laura," he said slowly, his voice breaking the comfortable silence. "I've been thinking a lot lately about what we've built here, about everything I've left behind, and I'm wondering, what's the next step for us? What does the future look like now?" Laura set her cup down, her brow furrowing slightly. "What do you mean? I thought we were doing fine. We've got our house, our family, each other. What more do we need?" James sighed, leaning back in his chair. "It's not just about what we have, it's about what's next. Do we keep going like this, in our little bubble, or do we push ourselves further? Do I continue to step away from everything I was before, or do I embrace it again, but differently? I have to decide what role I want money and success to play in our lives." It was a conversation they had avoided, but it was a necessary one. James had always defined himself by his wealth, and letting go of that part of his identity had been incredibly difficult. The last few months had shown him what a different life could feel like, one filled with purpose, love, and simple joys. But now he was left wondering if he could continue to live without the things he had worked so hard for, or if the temptation to return to the world of high stakes and success would prove too great. Laura reached out and took his hand. "James, I don't care about the money. I care about you. I care about this family and the life we've built. I don't want you to feel like you have to go back to that world to make me happy. I love the man you've become, not the one who had everything." Her words were a balm to his soul, but they also made him question everything. Could he really continue down this path? Or had his past, the life of a billionaire, left a mark on him that would never go away? Later that day, as James sat alone, in his office staring out the window, he felt the weight of his past pulling at him. His phone buzzed on the desk, an email from his lawyer. It was the final paperwork for the dissolution of his company. The settlement had been made, the business was officially closed, and his wealth was now transferred into a private account. The transition was complete. James' eyes scanned the email, and his heart skipped a beat as he saw the final balance. It was more money than most people could ever dream of, but it no longer felt like a victory. Instead, it felt like a burden, a constant reminder of who he had once been. He had worked hard to create something that meant nothing to him now. He had built a kingdom, only to realize it was a prison. He closed his laptop with a sigh and stood up. His mind was spinning, and for the first time in weeks he felt lost. He walked into the living room where Laura was reading a book on the couch and sat beside her. "I've made a decision," he said quietly. Laura looked up, her eyes searching his face. "What decision?" "I can't keep running from who I was, but I don't want to return to that world either," he said, his voice heavy with emotion. "I've spent my life chasing success, but I've never really thought about what it means to live a life with purpose. I want to find that purpose. I want to help people make a difference in a way that matters." The next few weeks were filled with discussions and planning. James decided to use his wealth and resources to create something that could bring real change. He invested in a local non-profit that helped underprivileged children in the area, offering scholarships, mentorship programs, and job training for those who needed it most. It wasn't a grand gesture or a flashy business venture. It was something simple, something that made a real impact. Laura supported his decision wholeheartedly. She saw the fire in his eyes again, the passion he had once had for building something. But this time, it wasn't about his empire. It was about giving back, creating opportunities for others, and finding meaning beyond money. As they worked together on the non-profit, James realized something important. It wasn't about the size of the gesture, the wealth, or the fame. It was about the people whose lives were being touched by what they were doing. He found fulfillment, not in the numbers but in the stories, the children who now had access to education, the families who could afford healthcare, and the workers who were trained for better jobs. James had discovered a new way to measure success, one that didn't rely on profit margins or stock prices. The success was in the smiles of the people they helped, in the progress of the community they served. One evening, as they sat on the porch after a long day of work, James turned to Laura. "I don't think I'll ever be able to completely walk away from my past. It's a part of who I am. But I've learned that true wealth isn't measured in dollars and cents. It's about the impact we have, the lives we touch, and the love we give." Laura smiled, squeezing his hand. "And that's the man I love." It had been a full year since James made the decision to walk away from his empire, a year of changes, challenges, and growth. What had once seemed like an impossible journey had transformed into something beautiful. Now, as he sat at the dining table with Laura, looking over the non-profit's progress, he couldn't help but feel a deep sense of satisfaction, a satisfaction that came not from financial gain, but from the heartwarming stories of transformation that the organization had created in the community. The non-profit had flourished under their leadership, and with every passing month, the impact became more evident. Local schools had partnered with the organization, offering scholarships to students who had previously thought college was an unreachable dream. Local businesses had donated resources, and the initiative had earned national recognition for its work with at-risk youth. But for James, none of this mattered more than seeing the smiles of the children they helped. Their success stories, their triumphs were the true measures of success. They had truly made a difference, and it was a difference that couldn't be quantified on a balance sheet. That morning, Laura and James were having breakfast on the back porch, enjoying the first warmth of spring. The sun was bright, the birds were singing, and the house felt more alive than it ever had before. There was an ease in their conversations now, a comfort that had been absent in the past. They had healed, individually and as a couple, and now they were looking forward to what the future might bring. "James, have you thought about what's next for us?" Laura asked, stirring her coffee slowly. He looked at her, his expression thoughtful. "What do you mean?" "I mean, we've spent so much time working on the non-profit, helping others, but have you thought about us? about what we want for our future. We've both changed so much. I feel like we're ready for the next chapter. Together." James smiled, his heart warmed by her words. He reached out and took her hand across the table, his fingers brushing against hers gently. "I've been thinking about that a lot lately," he admitted. "I think the next chapter is all about us, Laura. It's about finding new ways to grow together, not just in our work, but in our personal lives too. It's about creating the life we want, not just the life we think we should have." They spent the next few months focusing on building their future. James and Laura traveled more, taking time to experience new places and new cultures, and to deepen their connection. They visited small villages, met new people, and found joy in the simplicity of life, something James had long ago forgotten when he was consumed by his corporate empire. They also started talking about expanding their family, a thought that had been on both of their minds. They had always wanted children, but the timing had never felt right. Now, with the past behind them and their hearts in a better place, they began to explore the possibility of adoption. They both agreed that the idea of giving a child a home and a future was a natural extension of the work they were already doing with the nonprofit. But even with all of the joy and anticipation of their future, there were still moments of doubt. James occasionally found himself battling the temptation to return to the world of business. The old habits, the drive to prove himself to be the best, still tugged at him. But every time the temptation arose, he reminded himself of the life he had chosen. He thought about the children who now had a better future because of the work he and Laura had done. He thought about the lessons he had learned, that success is about what you give, not what you take. One evening, after a long day of meetings with the non-profits board, James came home to find Laura in the kitchen, preparing dinner. The smell of garlic and fresh basil filled the air, and he couldn't help but smile as he watched her. He walked up behind her, wrapping his arms around her waist, his chin resting on her shoulder. "Everything feels right," he said quietly. She turned her head to look at him, her smile warm and full of love. "It does, doesn't it?" For the first time in a long time, James felt truly at peace. He had learned to let go of the need for constant validation, to embrace the quieter, more meaningful moments in life. The past was no longer a shadow hanging over him. It was a part of who he was, yes, but it didn't define him. His actions now were driven by a desire to make a positive impact, to leave a legacy that wasn't about money, but about love and kindness. As they sat down to dinner that night, James reflected on the journey they had both taken. It hadn't been easy, but it had been worth it. The road to self-discovery and true happiness had been long, but it had brought them closer together than ever before. He had tested his family, his relationships, and even himself. And in the end, what he had found was something priceless, the love and support of the people who mattered most. James looked across the table at Laura, his heart full. "I don't know what the future holds, but I know this. No matter where we'll go together. We've already built something incredible, and we're just getting started." Laura's eyes sparkled and she reached for his hand. "Together," she echoed. "Always." The future was still uncertain, but for the first time in a long time, James was ready to embrace it, knowing that as long as they had each other, they could face anything. They had learned the true meaning of wealth, not in money, but in love, connection, and purpose, and in that moment, surrounded by the warmth of family, friends, and the work they had done, James felt that he had found everything he had been searching for. He had tested his family, yes, but in the process he had tested his own heart, and what he had found there was more valuable than anything he had ever accumulated in his life. This was their new beginning. Hit subscribe and leave a comment with where you're watching from. This story might just spark a new beginning. What's one thing that always pushes you forward, even when things get tough?